It will take about a week for it to be put on YouTube, Pasadena Public Library. So you have the opportunity to see this program again and share it with your family and your friends, because it will be extremely important to these particular times that we are in. So we have several people that are coming in, and I'm going to be admitting people right now. You can see that Susan has joined us, and she's waving right now, and she's going to be showing a PowerPoint. And Susan is currently at the University of Southern California as a professor. She teaches a class, and some of you came to our program on Saturday at the Hastings Branch Library featuring Naomi Harara, and she knows Naomi. She knows Alan Miyataki, and so she knows everyone that is participating in One City, well, not One City, One Story, in Asian American Pacific Islander Month for May for us. And we're very thankful that she has come to join us today.
Thank you. It's a small community.
Yes, a small community. Okay, so I think I'm going to wait just a few minutes to let everyone in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Because it's literally just 5 o'clock now. I hope all of you have had a chance to see the book. This is a copy of the book, When Can We Go Home Again? And when can we go back to America? We have 4 copies in the Pasadena Public Library, and 2 of them are checked out at this time. So you can put your request in and pick them up at the branch of your choice. It is a fabulous book. It has all the listings of all of the assembly centers, all of the camps. There is a glossary. There is an contributor notes on everyone that participated in it. There are chapter sources. And so it is a wonderful reference to everything that happened during this period in American history. So I encourage you to get this book and read it after the program. You will not be sorry. So I want to go ahead and tell you a little bit about the book. The foreword was by Secretary Norman Mineta. He has just passed away this past week. And Susan was telling me there was a Zoom program talking about his unfortunate passing, and more than 900 people attended, and they had to stop the attendance. So his foreword said, now for the first time ever, you can learn in one place about the entire trajectory of the Japanese American experience. And their stories will come alive for you as you read about their thoughts and feelings in their own words as the situation was unfolding. And that's exactly what you will experience when you read this book, and probably after the program. So about the book, during World War II, the United States government imprisoned more than 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living on the Pacific coast just because of their race. Many of them children, teenagers, and young adults who are US citizens, illuminate the frightening reality and enduring tragedy of this dark period in American history. Through their stories, you will confront how and why an unconstitutional, large-scale, racially based incarceration occurred in our country, founded on principles of justice and freedom. Now more than ever, their voices will resonate as our society grapples with the questions about racial identity, immigration, citizenship, and what it means to be an American. So Susan's family was forcibly removed from their homes and detained by the US government during World War II on the basis of their Japanese heritage. Susan was a leader in the campaign for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that acknowledged these wrongful actions and provided token reparation payments to the survivors of the wartime detention. She continues her commitment to educating the public about this shameful episode in our country's history and to creating greater awareness of why our civil liberties need to be protected now more than ever. Susan is a graduate of University of California, Irvine, with a degree in Russian linguistics, graduating summa cum laude, and she has a JD degree from Georgetown University and currently teaches a class at USC where she is a professor. And so at this time, we're just delighted to be able to welcome Susan. And thank you so much for sharing with us today and talking about your book, When Can We Go Back to America? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm really honored to be part of this Pasadena Public Library celebration of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and this opportunity to share with you a little bit of family history and the significance of it to the Asian American experience. And so I thought I'd start with sharing you a story from my high school days. I was over at a good friend's house for her 16th birthday celebration. And in her family, the tradition was on the 16th birthday, a mother would give the daughter a hope chest, a decorative chest, a special container to be able to keep some of her special things, her keepsakes. And I was intrigued by this concept. And I thought of the steamer trunk that was my grandfather's, that was gathering dust up in a shelf in my parents' garage. It had leather handles and metal clasps, and it looked like it could be a set piece from the Titanic. So I asked my mother if I could use this trunk in my bedroom. And I remember she was surprised and she said, you want that old thing? But she said, sure. And I hauled it up to my bedroom, and I was pleased with myself to be repurposing something that had been my grandfather's. And later my mother casually mentioned, she stopped by my room, and she said, when she and her parents left for camp, that my grandfather used this trunk to store some of their belongings that they had to leave behind. And that was all she said. And it took years before I really understood the significance of what it meant to, quote unquote, for them to have left for camp and to have left these belongings behind. It sounded like that camp might have been something fun, like summer camp or something pleasant. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. If any of you already know about this episode in our country's history, you know that these were detention facilities that were hastily constructed in isolated parts of the country. And as Christine mentioned in her intro, were used to detain 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry for the duration of World War II. So on the morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, my father and his family were about to start work in the vegetable fields in Orange County. They were farmers. And about noon, their landlord came to tell them that he had heard the news that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor, a place in Hawaii they hadn't heard of, and that they had better stay inside. That night, 2 FBI agents came to my father's parents' home. They did not have search warrants, but they barged their way in and went through the house and into their backyard, frightening 2 of my aunts who were bathing in the family's outdoor Japanese bathtub. Because he was not a community leader, my grandfather was not arrested that night, but by nightfall, the FBI had arrested thousands of other men known as members of the Issei generation, the first generation, simply because they were involved in the community in some way, principals of Japanese language schools, leaders in the civic and social clubs. They might have been martial arts teachers, They rounded up Buddhist and Shinto priests right away, and even travel agents who had done business with Japan. But in most cases, the families left behind had no idea where their husbands and their fathers had been taken, and in many cases would not be reunited with them for years. What my dad's family and the other Japanese American families did not know at the time is that the FBI had pre-identified the Japanese American community leaders to be ready to arrest them in the anticipated war with Japan. And they were arrested because they were aliens. But ironically, they and all the other first generation Issei were precluded by law from becoming naturalized citizens, whether they had the intention of making America their adopted country or not. The next morning, my father sat in his school assembly at Huntington Union High School as the entire school listened to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's address to Congress and heard that the United States was now at war with Japan. And even as a 14-year-old, my father knew that things were going to get ugly. As an honors student, he ended up dropping out of school rather than deal with the animosity and expressions of hatred that were targeted against him and anyone else perceived to have the face of the enemy. It made no matter that he and the other children of the Issei pioneer generation were American-born citizens, and this generation is known as the Nisei, or second generation. Very quickly, the prevailing view became that because of their race, the Issei immigrant aliens and the Nisei citizen children would be wholesale sympathizers and loyal to Japan as opposed to the United States, and should be suspected as potential spies and saboteurs. So many times over the years, I've heard people say, well, you have to understand, we were at war with Japan. But the suspicions about persons of Japanese ancestry did not just arise because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. From the time that the first Japanese immigrants came to the United States in the 1800s, they stepped into the racial discrimination that the Chinese immigrants who had arrived before them had faced. You can see in this 1882 political cartoon on the right that a Chinese man is barred entry to the quote unquote Golden Gate of Liberty. According to the sign, communists, Irish predecessors to the IRA, and quote unquote hoodlums were welcome, but not the Chinese. As contract laborers on the railroads in the continental West and on the pineapple, coffee, and sugarcane plantations in Hawaii, the Chinese and then later the Japanese immigrants were considered fit for backbreaking and often hazardous labor, but incapable of assimilation and unfit for citizenship. And we have the phrase from this time, always alien or forever foreign. Nevertheless, once the pioneer men fulfilled their labor contracts, a form of indentured servitude, really, many struck out on their own, mostly along the West Coast, as crop pickers, domestics, lumber mill and cannery workers, and other roles. They saved their money, they became entrepreneurs, they opened shops, boarding houses, restaurants, and small businesses. They bought fishing boats and built their own canneries. Others besides laborers, merchants, ministers, students, and especially women who came to marry the Issei men, went directly from Japan to the mainland here. And here are my paternal grandparents who arrived in the early turn of the century, and my maternal grandmother on the right, who arrived in 1914. Many Issei from rural areas of Japan brought with them expertise in farming, and they became particularly successful farmers with these techniques that were not practiced or known yet in the United States, and because of their industriousness. By the turn of the century, the Issei farmers in California were outproducing all other farmers in the state on a per acre basis. And my dad's family became known for their strawberries, tomatoes, sugar beets, and other vegetables, and they were particularly known for their celery. By the advent of World War I, the cards, though, were getting stacked against all persons of Japanese ancestry of both generations, collectively referred to as the Nikkei. And this is because US foreign relations with Japan became tense as Japan became a more militarily aggressive country. Fears and suspicions with geopolitical origins carried over to people of the same national origin. White labor unions used wedge politics to marshal anti-Japanese sentiment to their cause of eliminating the Japanese as economic competitors. The 1924 Immigration Act shut down any further immigration from Japan, a ban that would last until the 1952 Walter McCarran Immigration and Nationalities Act. Groups such as the Native Sons and Daughters of the Golden West wanted to keep our country white. The Yellow Peril propaganda both resulted from and reinforced prevailing notions of white supremacy. The so-called nativists were both appalled and affronted that the Nisei had birthright citizenship and considered it a sham that immigrants who they didn't consider to be worthy of being citizens could have children born here who would thereby become citizens. A powerful agribusiness lobby capitalized on all these political forces to enact alien land laws in the Western states that prevented the Japanese from long-term leases and from owning land. With Japan declared as a wartime enemy, the nativists and agribusinesses got the golden opportunity that they had wanted to remove those that they had considered to be un-American and positioned them as economic competitors. In short, it simply wasn't a matter of wartime hysteria that led to the political pressures to forcibly remove and detain persons who shared the ancestry of the wartime enemy. Most Nisei were children, teenagers, and young adults in 1942. For the most part, they had never been to Japan and had no connections with Japan. And they, truth be told, didn't even speak Japanese all that well. But nevertheless, to avoid acknowledging that the Nisei had rights as American citizens, our government referred to them with the invented euphemism of quote unquote non-aliens. On February 19, 1942, a little more than 10 weeks after the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the US military the authority to remove all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. The Department of Justice and its agency head, the Attorney General, had caved on any objections, constitutional and otherwise, to the military plans to require the Japanese American families to report for transportation to detention centers. Congress made it a crime to not comply with these military orders, so most felt they had no choice but to obey. They didn't know where they were being sent or how long they would be gone, and actually if they would ever be able to return. They had to sell or close businesses. Their bank accounts were frozen. My dad's family had to leave several acres of celery standing ready to harvest, and they had to leave behind. They had to store what they could with sympathetic friends or in churches and temples, and abandon what they didn't sell at a fraction of their worth to scavengers. They never recovered from the loss of their life savings and effort to this point. Everything about the process was dehumanizing, especially being issued a 5-digit number that replaced their family name. From the moment they arrived at the departure centers to board buses and trains to the assembly centers, they were surrounded by lines of soldiers with guns and fixed bayonets. The government photos were careful not to show the soldiers pointing the guns and bayonets at them, but there are many, many first-hand accounts telling of this. They were paralyzed with fear. The San Francisco News reported that, quote, most of the evacuees seemed to feel that they were going on a picnic. When they arrived at the assembly centers, they were surrounded by barbed wire, 24-hour armed guards in towers with searchlights, unannounced searches, and twice daily roll calls. Many incarcerees lived in horse stalls at the Santa Anita and Tanforan racetracks, reeking of the smell of manure that they could never get rid of. At other assembly centers that were converted from fairgrounds, incarcerees were put in livestock pens. Thousands more were housed in hastily constructed barracks built on their army model with mess halls. By the summer of 1942, they were transported to one of 10 War Relocation Authority detention facilities, which became known as the camps. These locations in Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, Arkansas, and Utah were in parts of the country where no one else wanted to be. They endured extreme weather without proper clothing, inedible food, limited supplies of hot water, and sporadically functioning toilets and showers without partitions. They were told to stuff straw into sacks for mattresses, and the overcrowded living conditions lacked any privacy. And yet, the Nisei went to great lengths to emphasize their American citizenship. And indeed, to prove this point, thousands of young Nisei men volunteered and were later drafted from behind the barbed wire and joined volunteers, mostly from Hawaii, in serving in units in the Pacific and in Europe. You might have heard of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion that served in some of the bloodiest battles in Europe, and remains today the most decorated military unit for its length of service and for its length of service in all of U.S. military history. And the MIS served in the Pacific Theater. Even after the war ended, President Roosevelt refused to close the camps until he had won re-election in what became his fourth term. Once the exclusion orders were lifted to finally allow the Japanese American families to return to their West Coast homes, they faced, again, intense discrimination, even terrorism, discrimination that continued for decades. The Quakers were among the few friends that the Japanese American community had, and the American Friends Service Committee established a hostel here in Pasadena. And this hostel provided a way station for those who were getting out of the camps to have a place to stay while they were looking for jobs. This hostel was located at 301 Kensington Place in the church house of the Japanese Union Church. And in my mother's War Relocation Authority file in the National Archives, I found a letter from this hostel addressed to my mother at her Heart Mountain camp, confirming her reservation for September 24, 1945. And this is what brought my mother and later her parents here to the Pasadena area, starting 80 years of my family's roots here in Pasadena. On my dad's side, following their release from the Poston, Arizona camp, my dad's family returned to Orange County, destitute, but resolved to try to restart their farming. One day when I was in college, my father told me about some of the challenges that he and his family faced during this post-war time. And in some ways, the hardships they faced and the challenges that they encountered were even harsher than what they had to deal with during their imprisonment during the war. For the first time, I started to understand the enormity of the injustice that had befallen them. As Christine mentioned, I was involved with a campaign that was known as redress. And this term comes from the portion of the First Amendment that says as citizens, we have the right to petition our government for a redress of grievances. My father was among the Nisei incarcerees and politically engaged third generation Sansei, my generation, who sought to bring attention to this episode in our country's history and to have the government acknowledge that its wartime actions were wrong. So I joined my father and countless other volunteers across the country in support of legislative and judicial redress initiatives. And with the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, signed by President Ronald Reagan, surviving incarcerees received an apology for the unjustified government actions and token payments as part of our country's only large-scale reparations program to date. And yet the legislation does not address that in 1944, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the incarceration on the basis of what it referred to as military necessity. You might have heard of the Korematsu Supreme Court decision. And while Korematsu and the other so-called wartime internment Supreme Court cases have been discredited, those cases have never been expressly overturned. And in fact, in its 2018 decision, Trump versus Hawaii, known as the travel ban decision, the Supreme Court followed the Korematsu court logic of accepting without inquiry the executive branch's assertion of a national security interest, put the phrase today instead of military necessity, as constitutional justification for an acknowledged infringement of the civil liberties of individuals on the basis of national origin and religion. So I hear those who say that in war, everyone suffers, let it lie and move on. And question, why should we care about this episode in our nation's past, 80 years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the issuance of Executive Order 9066? And I believe we should care because there are those who cite the Japanese American incarceration as justification for doing it again, simply because it was done before. In September 2018, Los Angeles City Council member David Brew held an event in Sherman Oaks in his district to talk with his constituents about locating possible homeless shelter and housing sites within the district. One attendee stood up to say that the federal government should just move out the homeless out of the urban areas and cited the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans as an example of how the government had removed quote unquote undesirables before. And since the government had done it before, why couldn't it just do that again? We saw history repeating itself after 9/11. Today we see parents separated from their families. We see children held in detention facilities without adequate education or health care. We see echoes of the past being repeated today, again and again. Not longer after Russia's attack on Ukraine began, and we all started to see images of Ukrainians leaving behind their homes with only what they could carry. One of my best friends, who's Ukrainian, said to me that she remembered in one of my presentations similar to this, showing the photo on the left of the Japanese American community on the day that they were being forcibly removed from their homes on Bay Bridge Island, Washington. And she said that that image stuck with her of what it meant to leave your home with only what you can carry, what it might have meant in 1942, and what it means to her, and I hope to us now in 2022. I mentioned that I had examined my mother's file, the War Relocation Authority file in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I reviewed the files of as many other family members as I could as well. I was happy to find some real treasures, such as a photo of my father at the age of, I think, about 15 or 16. But I was also grieved to learn in their medical records of my grandparents' poor health, their conditions exacerbated by the harsh camp environment. And I was really angered to read comments about their personalities, including in sociological assessments, that they most likely had no idea were even being made. And I was amazed to find the receipt issued to my grandfather when he retrieved his trunk from storage upon his return to Los Angeles in February 1946. So his trunk is actually behind me. It's here in my living room in Pasadena. It's an ever-present reminder to me of my family's wartime experience. And the story of my grandfather's trunk is just one of thousands that could be told about the 120,000 incarcerees whose legacies have been cloaked by emotion and obscured by the passage of time. And yet sometimes their messages are hiding in plain sight. So my book, When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration, tells many of these stories. And my goal was to make what happened to them real and relatable, and ultimately as a way to create understanding in hopes that others would join in working towards episodes like this not happening again. The philosopher and poet George Santana has said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I would add the corollary, those who don't know our past will find a way to reinvent it. I hope that as we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, that we will all come away with a greater appreciation for the importance of our world being a more equitable and compassionate place for all, and that we will have our own resolve, a greater resolve, to take our own actions to make it so. I so appreciate the chance to be part of the programming for the library, and now look forward to talking with Christine and you about anything that you might be interested in.
Thank you so much, Susan, for such a fabulous presentation. As I said before, I encourage everyone to get a copy of your book from the library. You can purchase it from Vroman's Bookstore. We have 4 copies in our library. 2 are currently checked out, and 2 are available for you to pick up at a branch of your choice when you make your reservation. So I'm fascinated by your title of your book. I understand there's a little urban myth that goes along with it. So could you, you talked about that in your book. Could you share that with us now?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, there's a story that circulated in the camps. It appears in one of the camp newsletters, and you know, people have shared it. And sometimes the story is about a little boy, a little girl. I chose to make her a little girl. And it came from the realization that as the families were removed from their home communities and now found themselves in an environment where everyone around them was Japanese. And so this was a phenomenon for everyone. And this child, this little girl, is reported to have said to her mother one day, thinking that her parents must have taken her to Japan to be surrounded by all Japanese, all Japanese community. And so she says to her mother one afternoon, something along the lines of, "Mommy, I don't like it here. When can we go home? I want to go back to America." And the Nisei generation, as I mentioned, because they were American-born citizens, found something very metaphorical. There's something very symbolic in this story to think that, well, we're American and yet we're treated like foreigners. And when can we go back to a country that will recognize our constitutional rights? And so it might be a little confusing at first, but that was the significance of the phrase, "When can we go back to America?"
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So talk to us a little bit about the 3 generations, or what the names, so that we all know the correct way to pronounce them, and what's the 1st and 2nd and 3rd generation.
Yeah, so they come from the Japanese words and the characters for 1, 2, and 3. So ichi is 1, but they use i. Sei means generation. So the 1st generation is Issei. Ni is 2, and so the 2nd generation is Nisei. 3 is San, and so my generation is Sansei. And now there's actually Yonsei, which is the 4th generation, and Gosei, which is the 5th generation, and even Rokusei, which is the 6th generation. And what comes as somewhat as a shock to me is among students at USC, when I was talking with one of the Japanese American clubs, and among students in my class, they have grandparents who are sansei, who are toddlers or born in camp, which makes them So that's kind of startling. So the term second generation is the first generation that was born here, but they're counting it as the generations that lived in the country.
Oh, okay. Thank you for explaining that to us very much. So tell us a little bit about the class that you teach at USC. And also you were talking about, you looked at the other presenters that we had and you knew all of them. So it's a very tight-knit community. And I noticed that the photo of the 3 toilets was taken by Toyo Miyatake. It had his name at the bottom of it. And of course, his grandson, Alan, is going to be presenting to us. Your family knew Toyo's family prior to the incarceration, correct?
My grandparents, my mother's side were in Little Tokyo. And so my grandparents were friends and contemporaries of Alan's grandparents, the famous Toyo Miyatake. And then Archie, who was grew up spent time in the camps, and my parents and Archie's wife, who just passed away herself, were very good friends. In fact, Archie took my wedding pictures. any photos in the family, it has to be Toyo Miyatake. And then Alan, who's the grandson of Toyo, is a friend as well. And so the class came about. I had the opportunity to create the class because of a major that USC in the history department started to offer, about 8 or so years ago, called Law, History, and Culture. And the department was interested in developing more curriculum, more courses that would be in that intersection of law, history, and culture. And so members of the department, I have a full-time job at USC running a research and academic institute. And so, but they knew my background and knew that I had the experience working with the legal issues, and invited me to put a proposal together to teach a class on the incarceration, but not just from the wartime experience, but this whole, a little bit of what I shared right now about the pre-war context, bringing it forward today into the relevance of societal issues. And that's what's, I think, really valuable and meaningful to the students today. And so it was in the process of doing my research and gathering the materials for the course that I had this body of materials, all this info. And then I had, it came about very serendipitously that I came to the attention of Simon & Schuster, that had already had the idea to do a book, but they had a concept that was just about Pearl Harbor's bomb. There's these things called camps. People were in place and then after the war, the camps closed, people went home. And it was my opportunity to be able to tell them, well, I'm really happy that a publisher of Simon & Schuster's heft would want to do a book on this topic, especially to make it accessible to young readers and to the general public. But there's so much more to the story, and this is what I think the real story is. So fortunately, I was able to tap into the materials that I used for the course to use as the basis for the book.
Oh, thank you for explaining that to us. Well, your book is fascinating because you have so many oral histories included in it and firsthand accounts. How did you research that? Because they were 15, 16, or 6 or 7 when they entered the camps. So that is decades ago.
Yeah. So about 30, 40 years ago, when the Nisei generation was just at a younger stage of their life, there was a great commitment by various organizations to record, to video their oral histories. The Japanese American National Museum, an organization that's based in Seattle that's called Densho. Some of the Nisei veterans organizations in particular did these captures of interviews with the Nisei veterans. So this material was out there, and many of these organizations have made the films available and even transcribed them. And then also, when I mentioned the campaign for the Redress Bill, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, what preceded that was a series of congressional commissions, and there were testimonies that were submitted and were also presented in person before the congressional commissions that took place in key areas across the country where survivors of the incarceration were living, including here in Los Angeles. And the Los Angeles Commission hearings became particularly meaningful because a volunteer crew, and this is in the early days, this is in the days of Betamax, had volunteered to video the testimonies that were given before the commissioners here in Los Angeles, which included my father. And through a lot of great community resolve to raise the money and seek foundation and other grant funding along the way, have been able to preserve those films. It went from beta to VHS, and then from VHS a handful of years ago to DVD. And so there's a lot of, and then primary sources, of course, now that are available through all the digitizing projects in the state of California at various universities and the National Archives. So there's lots of material out there, but no one had ever really pulled it together and woven together the context with the testimonies. So it was just a process. I was familiar with these materials, and it was just a process of digging through and doing a lot of reading, things that could be done online, just to try to pull out stories from people with different kinds of backgrounds and different kinds of experiences to that I could slice into the historical narrative. And many of the folks I knew, or it's like connections somehow in the family, but many I did not.
Oh, well, it's a fascinating compilation of stories by chapter with the different subjects related to each chapter and how their experience went. And it's a lot about for young people and teens and how they were affected by it. And I think that is just so important nowadays when we these programs for Asian American Pacific Islander Month that are sponsored by our friends also are part of a Book to Action grant to help people understand what happened so that we don't go forward and do this again. And when teens read these books, I think they can really relate to your book, especially because it's talking about the experiences that teens had at that particular time in the various camps. So it's interesting, you listed all of the assemblies centers, all of the camps, and then you went into information about each of the contributors. It's a huge amount of research.
Yeah,
so
that was his own project.
Yes, so how many years did this book take you?
Well, the material for the course I assembled over maybe a 4-year time span, and this isn't my full time, was something I was able to devote full time to. So it was really a late at night, early in the morning, weekend, holiday, vacation kind of project. But the research for most of the narrative of the book was a function of the course materials. Just because of the circumstances of how I came to Simon & Schuster's attention and what they had in mind for getting this book out, I started actually writing the narrative the 1st of July in 2019, and turned in a manuscript in January 2020. And you know what happened not long after that. Everything, so it was just starting, it was just kind of, you know, editors were just starting to pay attention to it, and then everything shut down in New York and really throughout the publishing houses. In the meantime, I started working on the material that did require some new research for the so-called back matter, the second half of the book, and then to try to find information about as many of the contributors as I could, and as one editor in particular really rolled up her sleeves and took on. He was a very good detective. So that was work that continued into the summer, and it was published in September this past fall, so September 2021. So a 14-month time frame, which is
overwhelming,
completely unusual. I just put my head down and was just caught up with adrenaline, I think.
Well, I think it shows how very, very important it is. And I see we finally do have some questions in chat, but I just wanted to point out to everybody, there is a poem in the book Saga of a People on page 88 to 90, written by a young 16-year-old, and she was the fourth prize among 6,000 entries, Scholastic Magazine's literary contest. And she was at the Parker Valley High School, the Poston Relocation Center. And so I encourage you, if you get the book, you should read this poem that she wrote. It's quite moving. So we have a question in chat, and as you have your questions, please put them in the chat. So let me read this question. Brian Takeda, maybe you know him, Susan. Generally, Japanese Americans have assimilated well into American society and do not necessarily experience outward discrimination, racism. What laws remain that discriminate against people of color? What work still needs to be done?
Well, thank you. There's a lot to that question. So let me try to tackle different parts of it. There is a phenomenon, and I talk about it a little bit in my book, about the Japanese Americans being known as the model minority. And so in that regard, it is thought to be the case that because of, I think after the war, the Nisei in particular did work very hard to be viewed as being all-American. I could just say personally, though, that society at large doesn't necessarily differentiate between Japanese American and anybody else that they think might be Asian or whatever. And even today, you know, on the metro or walking down a street, I get heckled, I get called things. So I, you know, personally experience that even today. My daughter, who is half Japanese, and my husband's family is Chinese, so she's half Chinese, and looks some parts of her look Japanese, some parts of her look Chinese, and she experiences behavior and sentiment that I think are discriminatory on the basis of appearance. There's not so much laws that discriminate as it is in terms of, and I'm going to put on a constitutional hat here, in terms of the application of laws and policies. And I think in terms of work, I think that the individual experiences help bring to light that however we look, we're still being judged on the basis of appearance. I don't disagree that the Japanese Americans have contributed well to American society. And what I think is really exciting and encouraging to me is among my daughter's generation, the Yonsei generation, and I mentioned the Gosei and Rokusei generation, many of them who have mixed heritages and don't identify with any one heritage, that there's a lot more orientation, a lot more awareness to working together, and to the phrase is they're to be allies and to stand in solidarity, and I think that's really great. John has asked a question: have I been to Manzanar? I have. My family wasn't at Manzanar, but this summer, for the first time, my mother was at Heart Mountain and her parents were at Heart Mountain. And I have not had the chance to be at Heart Mountain. And I understand that they have developed a really great interpretive center, and they're resuming a pilgrimage, the annual pilgrimage in person there. And I'm really honored to be part of the program at Heart Mountain this summer. And so I'll get to be there. There's not much at Poston, where my dad's family was.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. John Dean speaking. I just wanted to mention that Pasadena Concha is sponsoring a road trip to Manzanar this Saturday, leaving about 6:30 in the morning and coming back about 6:30, 7 o'clock in the evening. And we still have some seats open on the bus that's going up there. So if any of you that are watching this program are interested, I can put in the chat an email address that you can send your interest to, and let us know whether or not you'd like to, at the last minute, join this trip to Manzanar. I think it'll be a very fascinating program to participate in. So I don't want to take anything away from what you have been discussing, because that really helps provide more foundation to the Manzanar trip. And like you mentioned earlier, about trying to educate people, and that really is the most important thing that we can do, is to continue to educate people about what happened in the past could happen again. So thank you very much for that book and all of the work that you've done to educate people.
Thank you. Well, I really stand on the shoulders of a lot of great scholarship that has already been done. And if any of you are familiar with the Japanese American National Museum in Little Tokyo and Los Angeles, they just opened a really fabulous exhibit called Be Here 1942. And the site of the original building for the museum is the former Nishihonganji Temple on First Street and Central, when Central used to be a through street there. And that street, that corner in front of the what we call today the Nishi building, the Nishi Temple, was where those from Los Angeles were told to report, as I mentioned, to report to board the buses to go where they didn't know they were being taken. And in my mother's and her parents' case, were being taken to Santa Anita. And so what had been this favorite place in the community to gather for community events, and whether they were Buddhist or not, the temple and the other temples and churches functioned as these community centers. And so what had become this happy place had become this layer now of being a place of trauma. And the exhibit, they filmed with actors today, in some cases people with connection, the families, and one incarcerated herself is 90 years old and was a 10-year-old. They put 1942 costumes on them and replicated photos from Dorothea Lange and Clem Albers and other newspapers photos, and replicated a scene on one of those mornings when they had to report to board the buses with their suitcases and photographers taking pictures. And they filmed that, and now you can experience that on an iPad, walking on the space in the plaza in front of the Nishi building where all this took place. And then upstairs in the gallery, they did a similar scene with them boarding a train. And so you're actually, it's a little ghostly because you're on the iPad, you're seeing people like standing right next to you, walking up to them and whatever. But it really makes you feel like you're there among them in 1942. Erica, hi Erica, asks about how little the incarcerated Japanese Americans shared of their painful experiences with their children and grandchildren, and if I might talk a little bit more about this. And so there's a lot of work that's now being looked at in terms of the intergenerational traumatic effect. For the Issei, they were pretty much Japanese speaking. Some of them spoke English, but for the most part, like my two grandmothers, never had the ability to really get to know them very well because they really spoke very little English, and we spoke no or very little Japanese. And so the Issei generation, we just have very few stories because of the lack of translation. And for the Nisei, as my dad put it, we were just too busy just trying to reestablish our lives and put the past behind them. So it's a combination of it being too painful, bearing it like a reaction to any other traumatic experience, being frustrated, and trying to with people that tried to justify the government actions and saying, try to diminish that or rationalize it. And so in the feelings of the incarcerees, that it diminished their sense of wrong. They were treated like criminals, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. And there was a sense of, well, you must have done something. Why would the government have taken this action otherwise? And so it was a sense of shame, a sense of again, trying to just put the past behind them. There's also the notion in Japanese culture of not wanting to burden others with your trials, and not wanting to burden your children or your in my case, grandchildren with things that were negative. So always the sense of being positive and facing challenges with dignity. And this word is very important in the Japanese culture. I heard it a lot growing up. The word is gaman, and I use it in one of the chapter titles because gaman is not just to be resigned to your situation, but to face your challenges with strength and dignity. And so a lot of the mindset for the Issei and the Nisei was not to complain, and to tell the stories. I think in some way they thought it was harping on something that was negative. So it's pretty complicated, and yet with the commission hearings, that was something that now, as we look back, was a historic moment because so many of those who testified, and my experience was among them, where our family members were testifying and telling stories that we had never heard, and that it was a chance for them in a way that they felt was important and that would be taken seriously, and it was their opportunity to tell these stories. And person after person broke down and cried, and it was just something that they had not had the point in their time in their lives where they could unpack those feelings. So the comments that I get now from others that are my generation, who themselves are grandparents now, one of the comments that I've really appreciated along the way was from someone who shared that she's my generation's Sansei, and that she didn't really know what happened to her grandparents and parents, and that by reading my book and having that be a window into their experiences, that she now was feeling that she had some way to talk about it with her own children and grandchildren, and especially as we get removed now from the people who can talk about it firsthand.
Thank you so much, Susan, for this absolutely fabulous book. Several people in the chat are saying thank you for your incredible piece of work. You've given us something to read and think about for generations to come. I know you put your book together quickly, very fast, with lots and lots of research and lots and lots of time on your part, but it's a spectacular memoir, really, to what went on in America's history and how very, very important it is to future generations to know about it. So I encourage everyone to get your book. It's at the Pasadena Public Library. Read it and think about it, and it will give you a lot to think about even after this program. Susan's talked about it wonderfully with us and shared her stories with us this afternoon about when can we go back to America. As this program, sponsored by the Pasadena Public Library, and it's the Book to Action grant, we have a small survey that I will send out to all of the participants that registered today. So if you feel so inclined to fill it out and send it back in, that would be wonderful. But I hope you can attend some of our other programs and meet Alan Miyataka. If you haven't already met him, it would be wonderful. We've already had Naomi Harara that talked about her book, and perhaps your family knew her as well because they lived in Altadena. And they might have, though you were down more in Orange County, your family.
Yeah, Naomi and I have matched up how many, we keep matching up how many people we know in common. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right. So I can't thank you enough for sharing your time with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And we've all learned so much from you and from your wonderful book. Thank you very, very much. And thank everyone for attending tonight. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.